The platform was nearly empty that morning. Only a few figures stood waiting as the steam train pulled into the station. Its brakes, sighing like a tired animal settling down for rest. Skyla. Washed out blue, with the last threads of autumn fog dissolving over the hills. John stepped down from the carriage slowly, as if unsure whether the wooden planks underfoot were real or still part of a dream. He hadn't quite left behind. His boots, well worn and dusted with the remnants of Europe's muddy roads, made a soft thud with every step. Slung over his shoulder was a faded duffel bag. Inside, a pair of gloves, a few letters, a pocket Bible, and a photograph of his family that had creased along the corners. Tome. He paused for a moment, adjusting to the silence. No distant rumble of artillery, no shouted orders. Chiz birdsong, wind, and the gentle clinking of the station master's keys as he locked the waiting room door behind him. It had been 6 years since John last saw the old oak tree that leaned toward the tracks like an old friend trying to listen. 6 years since he left this small town in Kansas, waving from the back of another train with a pack full of hope and a heart that beat too fast. Taut. Now, that heart beat slowly, evenly, but with something new inside it. A tiredness that couldn't be seen, only carried. The cab driver waiting nearby didn't ask questions. He simply tipped his cap, loaded John's bag into the trunk, and said, "Home." John nodded. "Yes, sir. Home." They drove in silence, the tires crunching gently over gravel roads. Outside the window, the scenery rolled by like a moving painting. Golden fields now, bare after harvest. Barns standing like sentinels against the horizon, and scarecrows with their arms still open to a season that had already passed. John leaned his head against the glass. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. The trees, the roads, even the houses seemed to have shrunk. Or maybe he had grown too large. Not in body, but in the weight he carried. He closed his eyes briefly, in the soft rhythm of the road. Memories stirred. Faces of men who hadn't come back. The echo of boots on frozen earth in Belgium. A cigarette shared in a trench under a pale moon. And then, the silence that followed a sudden shell. The kind of silence that rang louder than any sound. Cobb rolled to a stop. Before him stood a white farmhouse with a porch wrapped around like a protective arm. It hadn't changed. The same wind chimes still hung from the eave, still sang a soft metallic lullaby in the breeze. The same rocking chair sat just to the left of the door, swaying gently, though no one was in it. John stood still, his hand on the gate. For a moment, he couldn't move. Then the screen door creaked open. A woman stepped out. Older than he remembered, but only just. Her back was a little more curved, her hair more silver than brown, and her hands thinner than before. But her eyes were still the same. She asked, though she knew the answer already. "Come." He nodded, and the bag slipped from his shoulder. "Mama." She didn't run. She just walked down the porch steps, her hands clasped to her chest, as if steadying her heart. K. And then, when she reached him, she placed both hands on his face like she did when he was a boy. Cut. And for a long, long moment, they didn't speak. The wind moved gently around them. The trees whispered above their heads. The world held its breath. That night, the house was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. John sat on the old armchair by the window, legs stretched out, hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa. His mother insisted on making, just like I used to, she said. He looked around the room. Everything was where it had always been. The clock ticking above the mantel, the crocheted blanket on the couch, the family photos in frames that had yellowed just slightly at the edges. It was as though the war had never happened here, as though time had paused and waited for him. But inside John, it hadn't paused. Inside, time had marched on, had aged him, carved lines into his soul that no one could see. And yet, in this moment, with the fire warm and his mother humming a half-forgotten lullaby in the kitchen, he felt something loosening in his chest. A knot, maybe. A long-held breath finally exhaled. Later, in his old bedroom, John lay awake for a while. The mattress creaked under his weight, familiar but foreign. His hand ran across the quilt. Handmade, patched with scraps of old shirts. Memories sewn into every corner. Cook. He could hear the crickets outside, the wind against the window pane, and the faint sigh of the house settling in the night. He thought of his father, gone long before the war, buried on the hill near the apple orchard. He thought of his brother Paul, who never made it off the beach in Normandy. And he thought of the men whose names he could still recite like a prayer. Carter, Louise, Thompson, each lost in a different place. Poe, but somehow always beside him. John closed his eyes. Somewhere, a train whistle sounded in the distance. Soft, almost like a lullaby. It faded into the night. The soldier was home, not just in body, but in spirit. In this room, in this house, in the stillness of the plains. And though there were things he would never say, memories he would carry alone, tonight he slept. Not as a soldier, not as a veteran, but as a son, a brother, a boy returned from war. And for the first time in years, he dreamed of nothing, just silence, peace. The sun filtered through the curtains in soft, golden strips, cuts. Outside, the world was beginning. 2 starbirds flitted between branches. Ka. A breeze rustled the corn stalks, still standing at the edge of the field, and the old windmill creaked once as it caught a gust. Inside the house, John sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. He watched the steam rise, curling and fading like the memories he'd tried to forget. His mother moved quietly around the kitchen, humming as she set slices of bread onto a skillet. The smell of butter and warm cast iron reminded him of childhood mornings before boot camps, before distant shores and falling snow on ruined cities. But even as he sat in this familiar place, the war was still there. Not in the room, but in the corners of his mind, where sound and color and time were different. He had not planned to remember that day, but memory has its own will, and today it chose the woods of the Ardennes. It had been early winter. The trees had lost most of their leaves, and the remaining ones crackled like dry paper in the cold wind. Snow had begun to fall the night before, gently, like an apology from the sky. It coated the foxholes and the rifles and the helmet brims of tired young men who didn't know whether the next day would come. John had crouched in the frozen earth, boots soaked through, fingers stiff. Next to him was Carter, tall, red-haired, and always smiling, even when there wasn't much to smile about. Carter had passed him a square of chocolate from a ration bar and whispered, "Merry Christmas," though it wasn't even December yet. That quiet moment in the Tree Stew Soldiers, pretending for a second they were just boys on a camping trip that had stayed with John longer than the firefight, longer than the explosions, longer than the cold. Thinking about something, his mother asked gently, placing a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. John looked up, blinking. Just remembering. She nodded. She didn't press. That was the thing about mothers, they knew when not to ask. He took a bite of toast and let the warmth anchor him to the present. Another memory surfaced without warning. This time, it was the countryside near Cannes, France. The road had been quiet. Too quiet. Trees bent in the heat, and wildflowers grew unbothered along the ditch. His unit had moved slowly, scanning windows, doorways, shadows, carve. They passed a farmhouse bombed out, blackened, and a child's doll lying in the dirt, face down, one arm torn. No one spoke. They had learned not to speak when the world looked like that. Later that night, John sat on a broken stone wall and wrote a letter to his mother. He didn't tell her what he had seen. Koa. He wrote about the moonlight instead, about how it made the wheat fields look like silver waves. He told her he was eating well, which was a lie, and that he hoped Paul was doing okay, which was a wish he whispered into every star he saw. Back in the kitchen, the radio played something soft, a violin piece, slow and sorrowful. John finished his breakfast and stood. The kitchen creaked under his steps, just as it always had. He wandered to the back porch, pushed the screen door open, and let the cool air hit his face. There was no smoke, no gunpowder, no barking orders, just the sound of wind in the grass, and far off, the murmur of a tractor starting up. He sat down on the porch swing and closed his eyes. Not all memories were sharp. Some came like watercolor, blurry, but powerful. There was the day in Paris, after the liberation. City had exploded in joy. but John had felt strangely distant, as though he couldn't quite rejoin the world yet. He'd walked the streets while people danced around him, kissed strangers, waved flags. He remembered passing a cafe. A woman was playing piano. She looked tired, like everyone else, but her hands were sure on the keys. Jian stood there for a long time, listening. He hadn't heard music in months. It made him cry, quietly, behind his helmet in shadows. Later that afternoon, John walked into town. The streets hadn't changed much. The same barber shop with the candy-striped pole. The same faded sign above Miller's General Store. Kids ran barefoot across the street, chasing a paper kite. Ha 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 ha. He tipped his hat to old Mr. Weaver, who stood sweeping his porch. The man blinked, then smiled slowly. "John Wilkes," he said with a kind of awe. "Back from the war." John nodded.
"Yes, sir."
They talked a bit. About the weather. About crops. About anything but war. And that was all right. At the library, he found an old chair near the window and sat for a while. Librarina. Soft-voiced woman with gray curls handed him a book without asking. Hemingway. Something about home and the sea. Tan turned the pages, but mostly he watched the afternoon sunlight move across the floorboards. When he returned home that evening, supper was ready. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, corn from the garden. His mother had even baked a pie. As they ate, they talked about the neighbors, about the harvest, about how the roof might need fixing before the next rain. Then, after dinner, they sat on the porch again. The stars came out slowly, flickering into view. Crickets began to chirp. John leaned back and listened. Not every soldier came home whole. Some didn't come home at all. John knew that. But tonight, he was here, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and pie, watching the stars like he used to as a boy. And in the spaces between the memories, in the pauses between the sentences, he found peace. He thought of Carter again, of the chocolate in the woods, of the girl at the piano in Paris. He thought of how strange it was that in the worst places, people still tried to find something beautiful, and maybe that was the thing that saved them. Not the weapons, not the medals, but the moments. The quiet, human moments. The wind shifted. A barn owl called somewhere in the distance. John stood, stretched, and looked up. "I'm home," he whispered. Not to anyone in particular, just to the sky. To the night. And the night whispered back, softly, like a friend welcoming you in. John walked through town the next morning. As the sky blushed faintly with early light, thin mist clung to the fields, and the shop fronts remained shuttered, their windows still dark. It was the quiet hour before the first clink of metal in the bakery, before children raced their bicycles through gravel paths, before anyone remembered to worry. He liked this hour. He had liked it even during the war. Before orders, before sounds of boots and engines, before decisions had to be made. In that brief stillness, the world was as close to peace as he could ever find. A loose rooster from one of the nearby farms strutted across the road, puffed up like a soldier in formation. John smiled, his hands deep in the pockets of his wool coat. The air smelled like dew and soil and the sweet smoke of someone's fireplace in the distance. This was home. Yet, somehow, he still felt like a guest in his own story. The grocery store was the first to open, Miller's General, as it had been for decades, with its squeaky door, creaking floors, and the smell of fresh ground coffee and wooden crates. "Morning, John," called a voice from behind the counter. Mr. Miller looked older, his hair whiter, his shoulders a little more rounded. But his voice still carried the same warmth it had when John was a boy buying licorice sticks for a penny. "Morning, sir," John said, tipping his cap. Mr. Miller walked around the counter with surprising speed and pulled John into a brief but firm hug. "We were waiting for you," he said. John wasn't sure what to say. "Thank you," he offered quietly. "You need anything, you just let me know. No charge. I've got my pay, Mr. Miller. Don't care. You brought back something this town was missing. Even if you don't know it." It was strange, the way people looked at him now. Not out of pity, nor curiosity, but like he was made of glass and light, like his presence alone was something sacred. "Glad you're back. Heard you were in France. Saw your mother crying the day the letter came saying you were coming home. He walked past the barber shop, where two old men paused mid-conversation to tip their hats. He waved. They nodded, Cohen. And though no words passed between them, there was understanding. It was a town that had waited. Past the schoolyard fence next, where children now spilled into the yard for recess. A few teachers stood watching, one of them Miss Avery, who had once taught John arithmetic and poetry. She turned, squinting for a moment before her eyes lit up. "My goodness," she said, walking toward him with cautious excitement. "John Wilkes."
"Yes,
"Ma'am." She shook his hand, her other hand gripping his tightly. "You made it home." "I did, see." She hesitated, then said softly, "I prayed for you. Every Sunday." "Thank you," John said, and meant it. She smiled and looked past him for a moment. "I taught your brother too, you know. Paul was a sweet boy." "I remember," John said, voice gentler now. He used to bring you apples. Even when they were half cut, they laughed together, too. And then, as though it was too fragile a memory to hold for long, she let his hand go. In the afternoon, John made his way to the chapel. It sat just outside of town, beside the cemetery, its white steeple rising modestly above a cluster of trees. The bell rope hung inside like a quiet promise, unused but waiting. The door creaked open. It smelled like polished wood and old The sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting soft pools of color on the pews. He sat near the back, where he used to sit with Paul during Sunday service, slipping each other paper notes and trying not to laugh when the preacher's voice cracked. K. He bowed his head, not to pray. Hadn't found the right words in years, but simply to be still. The silence welcomed him like an old friend. Later, John visited the cemetery. The headstones rose in quiet rows, each one with its own story. Birds chirped in the hedges, and the wind sighed gently over the dry grass. He found Paul's stone easily. The engravings were simple. Paul Wilkes, 1923 to 1944, beloved son, brave soul, forever missed. John knelt and rested a hand on the cool stone. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have been there." The breeze rustled through the trees, not in answer, but in acknowledgement. "I'm back now. You'd laugh at how quiet it is. Miller still sells the same cookies. Miss Avery still wears that red sweater. And Mama's hanging in there. She still sets your place at the table on Sundays. Ka." He paused. "I haven't cried in front of her yet. I think she's waiting for me to." He sat for a long while, not talking, just being. Car day. That evening, John walked home slowly, taking the long way through the meadows, through the woods where he and Paul used to run with slingshots and scraped knees. Everything was turning gold in the late light. The trees seemed taller, fuller. Deer moved through the trees, paused when it saw him, then vanished into the shadows. Key passed by the old watermill, its wheel now frozen in rust. Ivy clung to its stones, and moss softened the edges of the past. Here, too, the town had waited not just its people, but its paths, its still places, its rhythms. Pah! And slowly, with each step, John felt the weight of the war shift. Not gone. Never gone. But absorbed into something bigger than himself. A story that now had roots again. That night, over supper, his mother told stories from before the war when Paul played the trumpet in the school band. When John once fell into the creek trying to impress a girl. They laughed, not loudly, but enough. Ken. And when the table was cleared, and the stars returned to their rightful place in the sky, John stepped outside once more. Town. He looked at the town lights in the distance, twinkling gently in the valley like candles someone forgot to blow out. He whispered, "Thank you, into the dark, to the town, to the trees, to the silence that let him breathe again. Quieter now. No rumble of distant artillery, no engines droning above the clouds, no shouts in a language he didn't understand. Only the creak of the old farmhouse walls as they settled deeper into the earth, and the steady hum of crickets outside the open window. Khan sat at his desk beneath the soft glow of a small oil lamp. The desk was old and scarred with years of ink stains and schoolwork. As a boy, he had written essays here, drawn silly cartoons of his teachers, scratched initials into the underside of the drawer. Pen. But tonight, his pen moved slowly, deliberately. He had begun to write letters again, not to send, but to speak. Kit. The war had left him with too many things unsaid. Son feelings didn't fit in conversation. But in the hush of lamplight, with only the paper listening, he could let the silence stretch and unfold. The first letter was to Paul. Dear Paul, it's been almost a year. I still reach for you sometimes when I hear something funny or see something you de-roll your eyes at. I can still hear the way you used to whistle through your teeth when you were annoyed, like a little steam engine losing patience. I stopped by your grave today. It was quiet. I told you everything I could. I hope it was enough. Do you remember the summer we tried to sleep out in the barn, but got spooked by the owl? We ran back into the house like cowards, and Mama never let us forget it. I wish I could tell you what it was really like over there, but I think you knew. I think you felt it too. We were in the same mud, even if we were miles apart. Anyway, I'm home now. I'll keep your memory warm. I promise. Love. John. He folded the letter slowly, pressed it between the pages of an old novel Paul once loved, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and set it on the shelf. The paper wasn't meant to travel. It only needed to rest. The second letter was harder. It was addressed to no one in particular. To the ones who didn't make it, I think of you often. I don't remember the last words we said. Maybe there weren't any. Maybe we just moved, heads down, boots forward, thinking there would be another morning. I carry you with me, in the way I wake before dawn, in the way I flinch when thunder rolls too close, in the way I never waste bread. Your stories didn't end in the fields. They're still here in the warmth of a kitchen, the laughter of a child, the quiet swing of a porch seat. I walk for you now. I breathe slow and deep and look at the sky for you. I haven't forgotten. He left that letter folded beneath the lamp, like a candle for memory. That night, John found sleep more easily than he had in weeks. The letters had loosened something inside him, not wound tight since the day he boarded the ship back home. He dreamt not of war, but of rain falling softly on rooftops, of his mother humming while hanging laundry, of Paul at the creek skipping stones, always winning tea. And when he woke, the morning felt lighter. Each evening after that, he returned to the desk. Writing became a ritual not about retelling horrors, but capturing fragments of life he didn't want to lose. He wrote about the woman who played piano in Paris, her song floating through broken windows. He wrote about a German soldier who had surrendered, terrified, holding a picture of his daughter. He wrote about the way snow fell differently in France, heavier, quieter. Like the sky didn't want to be noticed. Sometimes he wrote to people still living. A letter to his former captain, thanking him for never raising his voice. One to a nurse named Helen, who had saved his arm after shrapnel tore through it. One to a boy named Frankie from Brooklyn, who had taught John how to roll cigarettes and dance badly. He didn't know if he would ever send them. But writing made him feel connected again, not just to those people, but to himself. One night, his mother walked past his door and paused. "Writing, Johnny?" she asked. Her voice, She stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'm glad. I think it helps, T." "It does." She smiled gently. "You always were better with a pen than a shovel." "I can still dig a mean trench," he replied, smiling back. She laughed. "Well, let's hope you don't have to, Tang." And with that, she left him to the lamplight. Outside, the fields rustled in the breeze. A lone owl called from the trees. The moon hung low, round and silver, as if keeping watch. Lick. Bish. Biv. Dear future, you don't know me yet, but I'm trying to reach you. I've seen things I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I've also seen moments so kind they made the worst bearable. If you're reading this, I hope your world is quieter. I hope your silence is chosen, not forced. I hope laughter comes easy, and bread is plenty, and no child knows what shell shock means. Remember the ones who came before? Can be gentle with the ones who return. We carried heavy things so you wouldn't have to. Please make that mean something. When he finished, he set the pen down, blew out the lamp, and stood for a long while by the window. The stars were bright and caring and eternal. He traced the constellations with his eyes, like he used to do from foxholes, whispering names to the dark. Orion, Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, Ka. But here, they weren't markers of maps or targets in the sky. Here, they were just stars again. Kit. He turned in for the night, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet, the quilts soft and familiar. Sleep came gently now, not in sudden collapse, but in surrender, like a letter folded, sealed, and placed in a drawer. The next morning came quietly, with a silver mist rolling off the fields like slow-moving breath. John sat on the porch with a mug of warm coffee cradled between his hands, listening to the world awaken. A distant crow called from the sycamores. The chickens were already pecking near the barn, and somewhere down the road, a screen door thumped shut. His mother stepped outside with a shawl around her shoulders. "You going out this morning?" she asked softly. John nodded. "Kata. Thought I'd walk to the McAllister's place." She gave a slow, knowing look, the kind that said she'd already guessed. "Tank. Your time. Son." He stood and stretched, the air crisp against his face. The walk would take the better part of an hour if he took the long way. He decided he would. The road to the McAllister farm was lined with cottonwoods, their leaves fluttering in the breeze like paper prayers. As he walked, John passed the old creek where he and Sam used to fish in the summers, their legs dangling over the edge of the bridge. Voices full of ambition and dreams they hadn't yet outgrown. Sam had always been the bold one, taller by an inch, faster by a mile, and full of ideas that made no sense but sounded too fun to refuse. It was Sam who dared John to kiss Jenny Hastings behind the schoolhouse. Sam who talked about California and motorcycles and the big city with stars in his eyes. They'd enlisted on the same day, shook hands at the station, but ended up in different units, different countries, different fates. Sam hadn't come back. The farm came into view just as the sun broke through the clouds. The McAllister house stood as it always had, white siding, green shutters, and a weathered barn to the right. The paint had chipped. The fence leaned in places, but it still looked lived in, loved. John paused at the gate. Dog barked once, then recognized him and fell quiet. Coo. He stepped onto the porch and knocked once on the doorframe. Kit. It was Mr. McAllister who answered. His once broad shoulders had narrowed, and his eyes carried the kind of sadness that never quite left. But when he saw John, his face changed. Part surprise, part memory, part warmth. "John Wilkes," he said, his voice low. "Yees, Mr." McAllister opened the door wider. "Come in, son. Come in." The inside of the house smelled like strong coffee, old wood, and something faintly floral, perhaps from the vase of faded lilacs on the kitchen table. Mrs. McAllister sat in a rocking chair near the window, her knitting paused in her lap. She looked older now, thinner, but her eyes still held that gentle spark. "Gianni," she said softly, her voice catching. John removed his cap. "Ma'am." "Sam would be glad you're here," she said. Blah. No one mentioned the war directly, but it hung in the corners of the room like a shadow that had long made itself at home. They talked about small things first, about the weather, about the price of feed, about the rooster that had started chasing the mailman. Mr. McAllister poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs and passed one to John. The house ticked with the soft sound of a wall clock, and then the conversation turned. You two were thick as thieves," Mr. McAllister said, smiling faintly. John nodded. He was like a brother to me, Mrs. McAllister stood slowly and crossed the room. She opened a drawer in the side cabinet and returned with a small wooden box. "We kept what they sent back," she said, placing the box on the table. Inside were letters, photographs, and a single metal coat. John reached out and picked up a picture. Sam standing in uniform, half smiling, eyes squinting into the sun. "We got the telegram in 44, Mr. McAllister said. France. A village near the river." John's hand tightened around the photo. "I was in France too," he said quietly. "A few months later. I didn't know until I got back." "You boys were so full of life," Mrs. McAllister murmured. "He'd talk about the things you two would do when it was all over. He wanted to build a garage. Said you'd run it together." John managed a soft smile. "He never told me that." "Well," she said, "he planned it anyway. Kungu da." They sat in silence for a while, sipping their coffee. The clock ticked on. John glanced out the window to the hill behind the barn, where a small white cross stood amid the grass. Coo. He didn't have to ask whose it was. "I'd like to sit with him for a while," he said gently. "Of course," Mr. McAllister said. "Stay as long as you like." John rose, thanked them, and walked slowly toward the hill. "Come." The breeze tugged gently at his coat as he climbed. The cross was simple wood, weathered, but clean. No name on it. Just a spot to remember, and the quiet all around. John sat on the ground, knees drawn up, arms resting across them. He stared out over the fields, golden and wide and endless. Fields he and Sam used to race through barefoot, daring each other to jump the creek, climb the tallest tree, chase the sun. He pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket. It wasn't addressed, but it was meant for Sam. "I came back. You didn't. I'm not sure what to say about that. Some days I'm grateful. Some days I wish it were the other way around. But I think you would have told me to stop talking nonsense, to live for both of us. So I'm trying. I wake up early. I help Mama. I write. I walk the old trails. But the world feels different without you in it. I hope, wherever you are, or it's quiet and peaceful, and maybe there's music. You always did like the piano, even if you pretended not to. I'll visit again. Save me a place under a tall cottonwood." John didn't cry. He just sat. Let the sun warm his shoulders. Let the wind whisper between the stalks. Let the memory of his friend live again for a little while. When he finally stood and walked back toward the farmhouse, he carried something lighter than when he came. Not joy, not closure, grace. Mrs. McAllister handed him a jar of preserves when he said goodbye. "Take this to your mother," she said, "and come by again soon." "I will," John promised. "Thank you both." As he walked down the dirt road, the farm growing smaller behind him, John felt the familiar ache of absence, but Also, some friendships didn't need time to continue. They just needed space and love and a little bit of silence. The first snowfall came quietly. It began with a hush, as if the sky itself paused to take a breath. Then, in the late hours of the evening, soft white flakes drifted from above, catching the lantern light outside John's window, swirling like slow-moving stars. He stood on the front porch, coat buttoned, hands deep in his pockets, watching it fall. The wind was gentle, barely a whisper, and the whole world seemed to hold still as the snow settled on fence posts, treetops, and the rusted handle of the well pump. Even the chickens had tucked themselves away for the night, their coop sealed against the chill. It was the first snow since he'd come home, and unlike the snows he remembered from Europe, heavy and gray, blanketing ruined towns and broken badies, this snow felt quite clean, almost forgiving. In the morning, the fields were transformed. The golden of late autumn had vanished, replaced by undisturbed sheets of white stretching across the land. The barn roof was dusted like powdered sugar. The trees wore coats of frost, their branches bowed under the gentle weight. John rose early, as he always did. Now there was comfort in rhythm, in morning light, and strong coffee, in the way his mother always hummed while slicing bread. They moved through their morning together, each word measured, but warm. When he stepped outside after breakfast, the snow crunched under his boots with a satisfying crisp. He shoveled the front steps slowly, deliberately, not just to clear the path, but to feel useful. To feel like the man who had once shoveled these same steps before ever hearing the word battalion. Afterward, he wandered toward the barn, his breath puffing visibly in the air. The animals stirred at his arrival. The old horse snorted in recognition. The cows blinked with slow, content eyes. He moved among them with care, checking water buckets, tossing hay, brushing frost from the handles of tools. There was something healing in the repetition, in these quiet tasks that needed no commands, no salutes, no radioed instructions. Just muscle, memory, and patience. Sometimes, he found himself humming old songs from childhood, or half-forgotten melodies the boys had sung to stay sane in foreign trenches. The tunes had returned with him, carried in the bones. Later, John took a walk down the back path behind the barn. The trees lining the trail were silent and bare, their skeletal forms stark against the snow. His boots left the only footprints, sharp prints through untouched drifts. He walked. The sky shifted from silver to soft blue, and the sun blinked briefly through the clouds, casting pale shadows across the landscape. He remembered winters before the war, sledding with Paul down the hill near Miller's Creek, building forts out of snow and pretending to be cowboys or explorers. Come home with red cheeks and frozen fingers, laughing through the night. He paused near the old wooden fence, where he and Paul had once carved their initials. The letters were still faintly visible, faded but present. J plus P, side by side. John touched the marks gently. "You'd love this snow," he said aloud, voice nearly lost in the wind. Back at the house, he brought in firewood from the shed and stacked it beside the hearth. The fire had burned low, and his mother was bent beside it, feeding it, kindling. The room smelled of pine, cinnamon, and the faint aroma of beeswax candles. "Cold out there?" she asked. "Only if you stop moving." She smiled and handed him a quilt from the armchair. "Rest a bit." John settled in his father's old seat by the fire, draping the quilt over his knees. The warmth seeped in slowly, like light entering a dark room. He watched the flames curl and crackle, orange and gold, and thought about the campfires in the forests of Belgium, hidden, dangerous to light, but too necessary to go without. Fire had always meant survival. Now it meant comfort. That evening, they made stew together. Chopped carrots, onions, potatoes, thick, hearty food for a winter night. They ate with soft conversation and long silences. Not uncomfortable, but familiar. Afterward, John returned to his desk. The lamp flickered to life, and the paper waited. He began to write again. "Dear Winter, you've arrived more gently than I expected, and I'm thankful for that. Cold. The way it settled into your bones and made the nights endless. But now, I see the beauty again. The softness of the world under snow. The way light catches on ice. The way the silence invites reflection instead of fear. See, you are not the same Winter. I survived in the war. You're slower, kinder. Like an old friend who sits beside you, saying nothing, just keeping you company. I think I can learn to love you again." John, he folded the page, placed it carefully into a box beside the others, and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Later, John stepped out one last time before bed. The world had gone silver under the moon. Every branch, every post, every rooftop shimmered faintly, calmed. The wind had calmed. The only sound was the faint creaking of the trees and his own breathing. He walked a few paces into the field, just enough to be surrounded by stillness. Looking up, he saw the stars, sharp, endless, distant, but no longer uncaring. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. This was not the battlefield. This was not a place to run from. This was home, quiet. And in the quiet of that winter night, surrounded by the hush of snow and the rhythm of his heartbeat, John knew. He was healing. Not quickly, but surely. Snow still blanketed the earth as Christmas drew near. The roads into town were lined with wreaths of pine and red ribbon, and the church bell rang softly each morning as if to remind people joy still lived here. Despite the long winter, despite the ache of memory, the town had dressed itself in warmth. John helped his mother string popcorn garlands and hang ornaments passed down through generations. Dulled. Some were chipped, others dulled by time, but each carried its own weight of memory of laughter, of stories once told under the glow of candles and the scent of pine needles. On Christmas Eve, they lit every lamp in the house, not because the night was dark, but because they could. Because the world outside, cold and still, needed a little light from within. John found himself at the desk again. The oil lamp burned gently beside a fresh sheet of paper. A mug of tea sat nearby, untouched, its steam curling upward and fading into the quiet air. He had written many letters since coming home, some to friends, some to ghosts, some to himself. But tonight, he wrote one to Paul, and to something more. Dear Paul, it's Christmas again. Mama made your favorite molasses cookies and roasted ham. She still puts out your stocking, Tay. I used to think it was too painful for her, but now I realize it's her way of remembering with love, not sorrow. There's a tree in the front room, smaller than we had as kids, but the same smell. That sharp, clean scent that wakes something deep inside you. We found the angel ornament you made in school. Gah. You'd laugh at how crooked it still is. Tonight I walked into town for the candlelight service. Everyone was there, Mr. Miller, the Avery family, even old Mr. Jenkins, who said he couldn't walk through snow anymore, saying, "Silent night, with cracked voices and full hearts. I lit a candle for you. Not because I needed to, but because it felt right, to give your name light in this world again. Caw, I still miss you. That won't change, but I'm beginning to carry you differently now. Not like a stone in my pocket, more like the beat of a quiet drum inside me, steady and low. You would have loved the snow this year. Merry Christmas, brother. Love, John." He folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of an old hymn book. Then he sat back, listening to the hush of the room, the way the wind whispered along the windowsills. From the kitchen came the scent of cinnamon and cloves. His mother was packing a tin of cookies for the widow Thompson down the road, who had no family left but never missed a Sunday service. Acts of quiet kindness had become their way of honoring those who didn't return. The war had taken so much, but it hadn't taken this. The next morning, John rose before the sun. He walked into the crisp December dawn, bundled in his wool coat and scarf. A thin mist floated over the fields. In the distance, the trees stood still, branches heavy with ice. He made his way to the hill where Paul was buried, a small wrapped package tucked under his arm. It wasn't much, just a photo and a letter tied together with twine, but it felt like a tradition worth beginning. When he arrived, the sky was shifting from slate gray to soft gold. The sun rose slowly, casting long blue shadows across the snow. John brushed the snow from the marker and sat. "I brought you something," he said, placing the bundle down. He stayed there, not speaking much, just watching the light move over the land. just breathing in the stillness, letting the silence say what he couldn't. On his way back, he saw the town again, faint curls of smoke rising from chimneys. He passed by the schoolhouse, where paper snowflakes lined the windows, by the general store, where someone had strung a banner, "Peace on Earth." He stopped by the chapel, not to pray, but to listen. Inside, a woman sang softly, rehearsing for the day's service. Her voice was plain but pure, and John stood by the door for a long while, eyes closed. The words came back to him from childhood. Sleep in heavenly peace. That's all he had ever wanted for Paul, for himself, for the world. And slowly, he believed it might be possible. Night, after dinner, John and his mother sat by the fire, clo. The house was warm, the lights soft, and the silence between them companionable. "Paul would be proud of you," she said suddenly, her voice soft. John looked at her. "I hope so, Ta." "I know so," she replied. "You came back. You're still here, Kurt. That takes courage too." He nodded. "Duh." And for the first time, he let the tears come quietly, without shame. Not because he was broken, but because he had begun to heal. His mother didn't say anything. She just reached across the armrest and held his hand. When he went to bed that night, the stars were bright again. See, the same stars he had looked up at from trenches, from forests, from ships at sea. Now they looked different, closer, somehow, more forgiving. P. lay beneath the old quilt, one hand behind his head, and listened to the quiet. The fire downstairs had burned low, and the house creaked gently as the wind pressed against its walls. He didn't dream of war that night. He dreamed of home, of fields in springtime, of laughter around a dinner table, of a brother who still walked beside him, even if unseen. John had survived, but more than that, he was living again. One letter, one breath, one morning of snow at a time.